The wind was a thief. It stole the heat from the stove-warmed air inside the small cabin the moment the door was opened, and it stole the breath from Alara's lungs whenever she ventured out. Tonight, it clawed at the sod roof and screamed down the stone chimney, a raw, hungry sound that echoed the emptiness in the house. It was the sound of her loneliness given voice. For 6 months, since the fever had taken John, the silence had been her heaviest burden. Now, the storm filled it with a violence that was almost a relief. Almost. She traced the rim of a chipped ceramic mug, the tea inside long gone cold. Outside, the world was a churning chaos of rain and prairie dust. Inside, she was just as unsettled, a vessel of quiet grief anchored to a failing patch of land the town of Redemption already considered forfeit. They watched her with pitying eyes when she went for supplies, their whispers following her like burrs on a hem. A woman alone can't last the winter. Henderson will have that land by Christmas. Their judgment was a constant, low-grade chill that seeped deeper than the autumn cold. A sudden, percussive sound ripped through the howl of the gale. It was not the crack of a branch or the shriek of the wind. It was a knock, hard, desperate, and unmistakably human. Alara froze, her hand clenching around the mug. No one came out this far, not on a clear day, and certainly not in a tempest like this. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced the dull armor of her sorrow. It was Henderson, she thought, coming to make another offer, to press his advantage in the dark. Or worse, a drifter, drawn by the lonely flicker of her lamp. She remained motionless, hoping the sound would be swallowed by the storm, a phantom of her imagination. It came again, louder this time, shaking the sturdy oak door in its frame. A voice, deep and raw, was torn to shreds by the wind, but she caught a single word, shelter. Slowly, she rose. The rifle John had taught her to use leaned by the hearth, cold and heavy. She ignored it. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She drew the bolt, her knuckles white, and opened the door a crack, bracing it against the wind's assault. A man stood on her porch, a figure made of rain and shadow. Water streamed from the brim of his hat, carving rivulets through the grime on his face. He was tall and broad, his duster soaked to the color of wet earth. But it wasn't him that held her gaze. Peeking out from the shelter of his coat was a child, a small girl with wide, terrified eyes and a face pale with cold. Her tiny frame was racked with shivers that were visible even in the gloom. The man's gaze met hers. It was direct, weary, but held no malice she could see, just a profound, bone-deep exhaustion. "Horse went lame," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm. "The little one. She can't take much more of this." Alara's mind screamed at her to slam the door, to preserve the fragile shell of her solitude. The whispers of the town returned. Foolish, reckless. But the sight of the child, so small and vulnerable against the vast, indifferent fury of the plains, chipped away at her fear. That child was a mirror of the vulnerability she felt every single day. "The house, it's not much," she heard herself say, her voice thin and reedy. "Anything," the man repeated, and the word was a prayer. Alara looked past him into the maelstrom. There was nothing but darkness. She pulled the door wider. "The shed is dry. I can give you blankets," he nodded. A single, sharp dip of his head. Gratitude. Relief. As she gathered the worn-wool blankets and an old lantern, the scent of wet wool and cold rain filled her small home. She handed them over, their fingers brushing. His were rough and calloused, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he took the items. She watched from the doorway as he led the child to the small, sturdy shed beside the cabin, the lantern casting a fragile bubble of gold against the oppressive dark. As he settled the girl inside, he turned and looked back at the cabin, at her, for just a moment. Then he pulled the shed door closed, and the light vanished. Alara bolted her own door, the sound echoing with a terrible finality. She had invited the wilderness to her doorstep, and now she could only wait for the dawn. The storm broke just before sunrise, leaving a scrubbed, clean world in its wake. The air was crisp and cold, the prairie grasses lay flattened and damp, and the sky was a bruised purple in the east. Alara moved through her morning chores on autopilot, her thoughts circling the shed. She expected the man and his daughter to be gone, vanished with the tempest. But when she glanced out the kitchen window while kneading dough, she saw him. He was standing by the corral, his back to her, examining the leg of a fine-boned mare. The child, Lily, sat on the top rail of the fence, bundled in a blanket, watching her father with silent intensity. He moved with a quiet, deliberate economy, his hands gentle but firm on the animal. There was a competence in his posture that was reassuring. He was not a man lost in the world, but a man navigating it with purpose, however weary. They did not leave. The horse, it seemed, needed more than a night's rest. For 3 days they existed in a state of silent orbit. Alara kept to her cabin and her garden, and the man, she had learned his name was Silas, kept to the shed and the corral. He never approached the house, never asked for more than she had given. The second morning, she awoke to find a neat stack of chopped firewood beside her own dwindling pile, far more than he would need for the small stove in the shed. The day after, she found the loose gate on her chicken coop had been repaired, the hinge tightened, the wood braced. He worked without a word, his actions a form of quiet barter. He did not ask for food, but she found herself baking an extra loaf of bread each morning. On the 4th day, as she worked in her vegetable patch, pulling the last of the hardy carrots from the soil, the little girl approached. Lily moved with a shy, tentative grace, her small boots making little impression on the damp earth. She stopped a few feet away, clutching a handful of stubborn prairie asters, their purple heads a shock of color against the muted landscape. She held them out to Alara, her gaze fixed on the ground. Alara straightened, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her apron. Her throat felt tight. It had been so long since anyone had offered her a gift, a thing of simple beauty with no expectation attached. She knelt, bringing herself to the child's level. "For me?" she asked softly. Lily nodded, her pigtails bobbing. She risked a glance up, her eyes the same serious gray as her father's. Alara took the flowers, their stems cool and fragile in her palm. "They're beautiful." "Thank you, Lily," she offered a small smile, and was rewarded with a fleeting, shy one in return. Later that afternoon, Alara walked to the shed. The door was ajar. Silas sat on a stool, mending a piece of tack, his large hands surprisingly nimble. Lily was drawing patterns in the dirt with a stick. Alara held out a small plate. On it were 2 thick slices of her fresh bread, slathered with golden honey from her hives. Silas looked up, his expression unreadable. He paused his work, wiped his hands on his trousers, and took the plate. "Thank you, ma'am," he said. It was the first time he had called her that. "Alara," she corrected gently. He gave a slight nod. "Silas," he broke off a piece of bread and handed it to Lily, who ate it with a solemn sort of delight. The exchange was simple, no more than a few words and a shared plate, but it felt like a treaty being signed. A fragile trust, built not on promises, but on a repaired fence, a stack of firewood, a handful of wildflowers, and a taste of honey. She was still afraid, but the fear was different now. It was no longer the sharp terror of the unknown, but the quiet, aching vulnerability of letting someone in. The peace of their strange, silent arrangement was shattered by the sound of approaching hoofbeats, arrogant and loud. Alara's stomach tightened. She knew that sound. It was Mr. Henderson, his expensive gelding kicking up clumps of her earth as if it already owned them. He reined in near the porch, his portly figure straining the seams of his tailored coat. His gaze swept over her small homestead with unconcealed disdain before landing on Silas, who had emerged from the shed and was standing quietly by the corral. "Well, Alara," Henderson began, his tone slick with false sympathy, "I see you've resorted to hiring drifters. Things must be worse than I thought." He smirked, a cruel twist of his lips. "A woman can't run a place like this. I've told you. It's a kindness, My offer. Ilara felt the old shame and fear rise like bile in her throat. For months, his words had chipped away at her resolve. But something was different today. She thought of the neatly stacked firewood, of Lily's small, trusting hand. She straightened her shoulders. He is not hired help, Mr. Henderson. He's my guest. Henderson laughed. A short, barking sound. A guest? In the shed? Don't be a fool, woman. This land requires a firm hand, not charity cases. The town council agrees. They're getting tired of this situation. He gestured vaguely at her. At the cabin, at her entire life. The threat was clear. He would use his influence to ruin her. Just as a tremor of her old fear began to take hold, Silas moved. He didn't stride, he simply arrived. He came to stand beside Ilara, not touching her, but his presence was a bulwark. He was taller than Henderson, his quiet stillness a stark contrast to the other man's blustering energy. He looked at Henderson, his gray eyes level and cool. "The lady asked you to leave her property," Silas said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the air with an authority that was startling. Henderson's face purpled with indignation. "And who in the hell are you to tell me anything? Some nameless saddle tramp who—" He was cut off by the arrival of a third rider, this one moving at a hurried clip. It was Sheriff Miller, his face flushed and beaded with sweat. He looked past Henderson, his eyes widening in relief when he saw Silas. "Mr. Thorne, thank heavens. We've been looking all over for you. The inaugural council meeting is about to start. They're all waiting." The name hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Thorne. Henderson's jaw went slack, his arrogant expression dissolving into one of stunned disbelief. Silas Thorne, the mysterious new landowner who had bought the old Rocking T ranch site unseen. The man the whole county was buzzing about. The newly appointed mayor of Redemption. Silas's gaze never left Henderson, but his posture shifted, the quiet cowboy receding to reveal the man of stature beneath. Henderson stammered, his face a mottled red and white. Mayor Thorne. I had no idea." Silas ignored him completely. His attention shifted to Ilara. For the first time, she saw a conflict in his eyes, a flicker of something complex and deeply unsettling. It looked like an apology. "Sheriff," Silas said, his voice regaining its calm measure. "See Mr. Henderson off this property," without another glance at the sputtering land baron. Silas looked back at Ilara. "I will be back this evening," he said, the words a quiet promise. "With Lily." Then he turned and walked with the sheriff toward the road, leaving Ilara standing in the sudden, deafening silence, the world tilted on its axis. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of confusion. Ilara moved through her home, the familiar space now feeling alien and strange. She felt a sting of betrayal, sharp and hot. He had deceived her, allowed her to believe he was a man with nothing, a drifter at the mercy of the elements. He was the mayor, a man of power and influence, a man who could have commanded a room at the finest hotel in Redemption. Yet he had accepted her meager offer of a shed, of blankets, of bread and honey. Why? The question echoed in the quiet cabin, unsettling the fragile peace she had found. She felt foolish, exposed. Her simple acts of kindness felt naive now, offered to a man who had needed none of it. When she saw him returning at dusk, walking up the path with Lily's small hand tucked in his, her heart constricted. He had left his horse with the sheriff. He was on foot, meeting her on her own ground. The setting sun bathed the prairie in a soft, forgiving light, the same light that had followed the storm. Lily, upon seeing her, broke away from her father and ran to Ilara, wrapping her arms around her leg in a fierce, trusting hug. The gesture disarmed Ilara completely. She rested a hand on the child's head, her anger and confusion beginning to ebb, replaced by a deep, resonant ache. Silas stopped before her, taking off his hat. In the golden light, the weariness on his face seemed more profound. He was not a cowboy, not a mayor, just a man, a father. "Ilara," he began, his voice low, "I owe you an explanation." She simply waited, her hand still resting on Lily's hair. "When I came to this town," he said, his gaze sweeping over the small cabin, the neat garden, the vast sky, "I heard stories about Henderson's greed, about a widow on her own, and a town council ready to let him have his way. I didn't want to meet redemption from a mayor's office. I wanted to see its heart, to know its people when they weren't trying to impress a man of position." He looked directly at her, his eyes holding a sincere, raw honesty. "My horse truly did go lame, just outside your property line. The storm was real, but my need, it was for something more than shelter from the rain. I wanted to see who would help a man with nothing." His words settled over her, not as an excuse, but as a truth. He had been testing the world, not her. He had been searching for character, for the very resilience and compassion the town gossips had overlooked in her. "You offered a stranger and his child shelter when you had little to spare," he continued, his voice soft with an emotion she couldn't name. "You showed my daughter a kindness she hasn't seen in a long time. That is the kind of character this town needs. The kind I need in that moment." The power dynamic between them evaporated. He was not Mayor Thorne. He was Silas, a man who had seen her, truly seen her, not as a pitiable widow or a problem to be solved, but as a woman of strength. She had spent months feeling defined by her loss and her solitude. But standing there, with a child's arms around her leg and a man's respect in his eyes, she felt defined by her choices. Strength, she realized, was not the absence of fear or vulnerability. It was the quiet, determined act of lighting a lantern for a stranger in a storm. It was the courage to offer a piece of bread when your own pantry was nearly bare. Later, they sat on her small porch as the stars began to prick the velvet darkness. Lily slept soundly in a chair, wrapped in a blanket. They spoke little, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with a new, unspoken understanding. The vast, lonely landscape that had once mirrored her grief now stretched before them as a shared horizon, full of quiet promise. The wind still whispered over the prairie, but tonight, it did not sound like a thief. It sounded like a new beginning,